Spots. It was no wonder no one came around, besides Manny, that is. The place was crawling with filth. He'd already washed his cereal bowl and spoon. He put them both away like he did every morning. But that counter, the bright solid white surface showed everything. Jacob took one of his new cloths from the plastic pack and grabbed the disinfectant cleaner from the shelf under his white matching island and began spraying the surfaces. After wiping them down, he folded the cloth and pressed it tightly into the creased edges and followed along the wall, digging out the muck hiding in the tightest of tight places. He looked at his watch. It was almost time for her to show up. She hadn't said she was coming today, but she didn't make it yesterday. The idea of her missing out on 2 visits in a row was unheard of, and this place, looking the way it did, was even more unheard of. It was not a good time for a casual visit, that much was for sure. He liked her casual visits, though. There were times this lonely apartment tried to get the best of him. Sure, he had his television. He loved watching Jeopardy, and occasionally he'd stumble across a good documentary that would catch his attention, but that wasn't like human contact. It seemed he'd lost all of that when he moved to Madison Springs nearly 4 years ago. Looking back, he didn't know what possessed him to move here in the first place. He had no family here, no one he knew, and there had been no job offers. So why did he move here? Oh yes, it was because there was no family here and no one he knew. His brother called a few times since he left the fine city of Bryson, but his mother and father never lifted the receiver even once to check on him. His brother faded, growing more and more distant between calls until they finally stopped altogether. But it didn't matter. If he wanted to talk to them, he wouldn't have left Bryson in the first place. All was quiet on the Western Front, or in this case, the Eastern Front. Manny had once brought up getting him a dog, but he quickly shunned the idea away. It was hard enough keeping this place clean without an animal multiplying his work by 10, maybe even 20 if it wasn't trained for indoors. Besides, an occasional, sometimes daily visit from her was plenty to keep him from going insane from talking to the shadows. He squatted, bringing his eyes down even with the countertop, and looked as the morning sun shone through the window and reflected across it. It at least looked better. But the floor! Every footprint from the bedroom to the cupboard, to the table, then back to the cupboard, was like ghosts haunting him, reminding him that it was time to clean that kitchen. He reached into the broom closet, took the mop, a disposable wipe, along with a spray bottle of ammonia, and closed the door. He began spraying the floor as he walked slowly backward toward the living room entrance, and then carefully made his way back across the slippery floor to the mop. That's when the knock came at the door. It was Manny, and she never once thought of showing the courtesy of being a few minutes late. Jacob leaned the mop against the island and headed into the living room. He opened the door, and there she stood in her black, silky flowered top that he had bought for her online a couple of weeks back. The neon green stems wrapped around the bright red peony's pattern like the legs of a spider webbing its next meal. Those bright colors against the blackest of black silks offered the protection of never being run over by a car while crossing the street. Her round face and nerd-framed glasses seemed to work well together in creating the perfect geek, but her smile, frizzy hair, and personality, almost as colorful as her new shirt, gathered the difference, making her almost pretty, but not quite. Jacob stepped back, opening the door wide. "Come inward," he said, and motioned his hand, showing her in. She took 2 steps in and took a quick step back. She squinted, turned her head to the side, and began fanning her hand in front of her face. "Good Lord!" she screamed. The potent fume of ammonia invaded her nostrils like the vapors of a gas chamber. "What are you trying to do, peel the paint off the walls?" "You caught me cleaning," Jacob said, and quickly closed the door behind her. "Cleaning? You're going to kill yourself is what you're going to do." She walked into the kitchen and took up the mop. "I'll do that," Jacob said, holding his hand out to her. "No, you do whatever else you need to get done, and I'll take care of this. If I know you, you'll be working in this apartment all day, and I won't get a bit of your attention." After everything was done, Manny fell onto the couch, red-faced and exhausted. "That's it, all done," she said, with her body splattered across the center of the couch like a shot from a paintball gun. Yeah, I just need to... No, Manny interrupted. You're finished too. She patted the cushion next to her. Come sit down. But I really need to do something with that bedroom. Shush! You're out of cleaners, young man. You used them all up and nearly poisoned me in the process. This is the cleanest apartment on the face of the planet. There are surgeons that don't keep their forceps as clean as you keep your toilet bowl. Jacob smiled. Manny certainly had a way with words, and she could bring out that hidden side of him that no one else could seem to find. She made him feel young, not that 26 was old or anything, but she made him feel really young, like a kid type of young. She, at her ripe old age of 31, was older than he, but she always stated that age was just a number. Everybody's got one, she said on many occasions, and also finished it with her cocky smile that he loved so much. So what are you going to do today? She asked, already knowing the answer. I haven't really thought about it, he said. Nothing, I guess. Good. No plans means that you're mine for the afternoon. Jacob looked at her with concern in his eyes. What did he just get himself into? Don't look at me that way, she said. I'm just going to take you out to lunch, and I'll bring you right back to your hole. But I just ate some cereal about an hour ago, and I'm really not hungry. Okay, then. We'll wait about 15 minutes before we go. How long do you think that bowl of poopy puffs is going to last after the job we just put on your already clean apartment? Yes, sir. I'm getting you out of these walls today. Jacob suddenly grew weak in the knees and sat down beside her on the sofa. Look, Manny, we don't have to go out to dinner. I have things we can fix here. It'll be a lot cheaper. Nope, she said, pointing her nose into the air. You're going to put on your jacket and get out for at least an hour, maybe 2. Look at you sitting here in your PJs. Your skin is pale and you look sick. How many days has it been since you've been outside? I go out nearly every day to get my mail. Yes, and then you bring your little weird butt back in here and close the door. I know you're crazy. Everybody around here knows it. But even crazy people like you need fresh air. Jacob gave a weak but sincere smile. The restaurant was crowded with mostly afternoon lunch breakers and senior citizens. People crowded each other at the buffet bar, leaning over one another's shoulders, breathing down each other's necks, and even physically touching on occasion. Jacob hated buffets, but it was a well-known fact that Manny loved them. You get more for the buck, she always said. But was it worth it? The risk of getting sick, catching some sort of gross, nasty germ from some careless person ahead of you, was a constant threat in these places. It wasn't worth it to him, but apparently the way she thought of him was worth it, because he was there after all. He looked at the sneeze guard. If you don't know what a sneeze guard is, it's the clear plastic window above the buffet bars to prevent people's germs from getting into the food if they sneeze. Thus, it's called a sneeze guard. It hangs about a foot, give or take 2 inches from the top, not near low enough to stop a real doozy of a sneeze. It might stop a booger if someone had their head aimed upward when they blew it out, but who does that? When someone sneezes, they lose control for only a moment, but that's the moment that counts the most. Their neck bends back, and they wind up for the pitch. Right over the fried green tomatoes, and who would ever know? It was a good thing Jacob ordered a fresh box of masks the week before, because he had been out. And when Manny went off on one of these outing spasms, it would be easier to kiss a grizzly on the lips than to talk her out of going. But maybe she was right. Maybe he was crazy. Here he was, standing in a restaurant in a germ mask, afraid to shake hands with anybody, afraid to touch anything, especially doorknobs, and of all things, sink faucets. Yes, ladies and germs, he was even afraid to wash his hands in a public restroom. He was afraid of all these things, but Manny wasn't a threat. She came into his apartment nearly every day from the busy street outside, and didn't even leave footprints when she walked, and it didn't bother him if she put her hand on his shoulder, even if she forgot to wash first. He knew that all of this was in his mind. He knew it, but still he couldn't get past it. Things hadn't always been this way for Jacob. He wasn't sure, but he thought it went back to a very young age to when his brother planted a fear seed into his brain. He couldn't remember how old he was at the time, but he did remember that it was before he started going to school. His mother shouted from the kitchen for everyone to wash up for dinner. His older brother told him that if he didn't wash his hands well enough before he ate, worms would grow inside of his stomach. He remembered his first years in school, playing with the other kids at recess and eating in the cafeteria like everybody else. Of course, even at the age of 6, he remembered washing his hands whenever he was about to eat something or had been playing outside. Most adults have to tell their children to do such things, but not his mother, no way. He did it on his own. He didn't want worms growing inside of him. As he grew, the seed his brother had planted grew with him. He was older now, and he knew the worm story was just a tale his brother got a giggle out of. But there was the truth of germs. They were dangerous. They could cause diseases, sickness, and even death. They were everywhere, in everything, on everyone. He could see them, so why couldn't everyone else? Why was Manny different? Why could he talk to her without wearing his mask? Why could she reach out without him shying away? The answer was plain as the nose on his face. He must be crazy. He was a dashing young man, if not a little on the thin side, and had a good mind for internet work. He had been earning a modest living online for the past few years designing websites and offering support. He must have been somewhat fun to be around, because Manny never seemed to get bored by coming to see him, even though getting him to leave the apartment was like trying to talk a tooth into crawling out of its gums. It was a dark side that kept him from living, but in his eyes, that side kept him alive. Jacob stood there as Manny slid her debit card through the reader. He looked like a dummy on a department store's sales floor, stiff, cold, and lifeless. He was watching and dreading. Manny did, however, order his food special from the kitchen. She thought that would put his mind at ease, but who was to say that that didn't actually come off at the bar itself? Jacob didn't ask the question out loud. She was trying to make it easier on him, and he appreciated her for that. But the question remained in his head. A man walked out of the restroom and stood talking to another man wearing a similar suit to his. They must have worked in the same offices, probably attorneys or bank managers, judging by the way they were dressed. The man that had just exited the restroom had spots on the crotch of his gray dress slacks. It looked like orange juice splatter, only it was oozing down the material toward his leg. There were more orange-yellow spots on his fingers. How could he not see them? He shook the other man's hand, and some of the spots transferred to him. They were moving up to the unsuspected man's wrist and under the buttoned sleeve of his shirt and disappeared. Jacob looked around the crowded dining room and saw more spots, brown spots, orange spots, yellow spots, and green on everything. The sneeze guard was covered as well as the edge of the bar. A waitress walked over with a towel and began wiping it down. Maybe she saw it too. But no. She walked away and the spots were still there. Only now they were on her towel as she began wiping down the table someone had just left. "Come on," Manny said as she walked toward the empty table, the freshly wiped one with the spots all over it. Jacob followed with an unconscious snarl stretched across his face. He sat in the chair across from hers, but instead of sitting, she took her empty plate and headed happily for the bar. He sat with his chair pushed back a foot from the table, eyes shifting from one stranger to the next. Some were laughing, some smiling, and some held more solemn expressions. But one thing they all held in common with one another, not one of them could see what he was seeing. Manny sat in front of him with her plate stacked like Mount Everest. There didn't seem to be any pattern to her choices as she piled it on. It was all compounded together like table scraps that you would feed to the dog. He could see the meatloaf clearly on top, beans, peas, a piece of chicken buried down near the bottom, and something that resembled barbecue, but he couldn't be sure. There was one thing on her plate that he could be sure of, and that was them. They were in the food, so visible that they were almost glowing. Their bodies swelled and shrank like heavy-breathing ticks as they fed in her plate. They were revolting. Jacob's throat tightened, and he felt like he was going to be sick, but he looked away and fought to regain control. After all, it was all in his head, and he knew that. Manny looked at him with concern. She knew what it was, though she couldn't see what he was seeing. She knew him, and she knew his weakness. She had been trying to help him by getting him out of the apartment. If he faced his demons, maybe he would see that things weren't so bad in the outside world. Maybe he would start getting out, and who knows, eventually might even take off his mask. But that wasn't going to be today, obviously. He seemed to come out of nowhere. The waiter set Jacob's plate on the table in front of him. "Can I get you anything else?" he asked with a friendly smile. Jacob sat in a state of shock, staring at the plate of yellowish tick-like creatures feeding in his plate, breeding in his plate, owning his plate. "No, thank you," Manny answered politely for him. "All right, hope you enjoy," he answered with a smile and walked back toward the kitchen. "Jacob, are you okay? Jacob?" Her distant voice echoed as if in a tunnel, while he glared, hypnotized by the plate. They were crawling over the top of one another, trying to find the right place to bury themselves into the mashed potatoes. Some had already buried into a Salisbury steak and were almost hidden by the gravy, but he could still see the mild glow as they were glowing stronger and stronger as they fed. "Jacob," she said, finally capturing his attention. He looked up at her, and she saw for the first time in 3 years of friendship just how serious things had become. He was crying. His arms were curled to his chest, and his limp hands hung freely from their wrist as he sat trembling like a frightened child. Without another thought, she snatched $2 bills from her purse and slapped them onto the table. "Let's get you out of here," she said. She got up from the table, took him by the arm, and left the restaurant. He had calmed down somewhat when she got him home. She walked him into his apartment and went to the kitchen to fetch him a bottle of water while he sat on the living room sofa. The nauseous feelings had passed now. At this point he was trying to deal with the embarrassment of the situation, but it couldn't be as bad as the embarrassment he had put her through as everyone watched her leading the crying masked man out of the restaurant. All he could say as she drove him home was, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What is wrong with me?" over and over as he rocked back and forth in the passenger seat. It was clear that something really was wrong. What made it even worse was that he could see it himself. Something was very wrong, but it just wouldn't stop. It was eating him alive. There had been a time that those things weren't so bad. When he first moved to Madison Springs, for example. At first he had no washer or dryer, so he had to use the laundry room down on the first floor of his building. That would be unheard of now. He didn't like the idea of it then. Luckily for him, the door was always unlocked. He found that the best time to go was in the wee hours of the morning, usually around 2 or 3. There was never anyone in there at that time. Even back then, he poured a cup of detergent into the empty washing machine and ran a complete cycle with the temperature set to hot before putting his laundry in it. While his clothes sloshed back and forth in the soapy suds, he spent his time spraying the folding table with disinfectants and cleaning the inside of the public dryer. He saw the spots in the laundry room, but they were fewer and much smaller then, and their color was darker, more like bugs and less like poison factories. "I'm taking you to a doctor tomorrow," Manny said as she entered the living room. She handed him his bottle of water and sat beside him. Jacob nodded in agreement and sipped his water. He needed it. He needed her. And at last he accepted that he needed help. If it wasn't for her, he would be alone. His brother hadn't called in over 3 years, and his parents, if they were still living, never called. If it wasn't for Manny, living only 3 doors down, he would have no one. She had become far more than a neighbor over the last few years. She had become his best and only friend. She was his family now, and he appreciated her. He wondered how she felt about him now. Her face looked angry, but he knew that she wasn't. She was concerned, maybe even scared for him. Who wouldn't be? The conversation had dried up. Neither of them knew what to say, so he sat staring at the living room's white curtains glowing in the afternoon sun. She sat staring at him, sometimes staring through him as her mind drifted in and out of the day's events. They sat that way for nearly an hour before she asked if he was okay. Of course he said yes to the question. "Mind if I raid your kitchen? Somebody didn't let me eat and I'm still hungry." She held a smirk on her face that relaxed him. She had just let out a half-joke, which meant she hadn't lost her sense of humor with him at least. It was her way of poking fun at the situation without poking fun at him. "Sure, help yourself," he said. He continued to sit for several minutes collecting his thoughts as he listened to her clinking and clanking around as she prowled his cabinets. His head ached and he felt weak. He too needed to eat something, but he didn't want food. Instead, he turned and pulled his feet up onto the couch and closed his eyes. It was the clicking that woke him. He had heard the sound in his dream before it finally brought him back to consciousness. He glanced around the dark room and realized that he was alone. He had fallen asleep, and Manny, being the friend she was, knew he needed the rest, so she had turned off the lights and went home. That part of the puzzle was easy, but now the question was, what time was it? And even more of a question, what was that noise? The outside light sent its mild glow through the curtains of his living room window, allowing him to see the lamp's brass socket and the on-off switch. He reached over his head and turned the light on. Blinded by the sudden brightness, he squinted and shaded his eyes with his hand, allowing them to slowly adjust. Click, clack, clickety-clack. The sound was faint, but loud enough for him to know that it wasn't a lingering hallucination from his dream. For the past 4 years the apartment had been quiet, but then he never made a habit of falling asleep on the living room sofa either. Maybe it was a sound that he just never heard from his bedroom, and therefore nothing to worry about. But no, this was something he had never heard before at all. A mouse, maybe. He didn't know. This sound was completely foreign to his ears, and it was coming from the kitchen. Maybe Manny had washed her hands and didn't turn the water off completely. Maybe the faucet was dripping. Maybe he could play this guessing game all night and never find out for sure what it is. He got up from the couch and staggered sleepily across the living room toward the kitchen. He stepped into the open doorway and clicked on the light. There it was, a half-eaten piece of chocolate cake, and it was sitting on the island counter. And there they were, all over the cake, all over the counter, and crawling down the sides of the island to the kitchen floor. Giant crawling shadows danced along the walls, the floor, and the cabinets. He looked up at the overhead light and watched as a colony crawled out of the fixture. Jacob's eyes bulged almost out of their sockets, and he stumbled backward into the living room. He watched in shock as the 6-legged tick-like creatures gathered on the white tile floor of his kitchen and began to make their way toward him. Click, clack, clickety-clack was the sound of their mechanical legs as they grew closer, with their filthy, disease-carrying biters snapping wildly. He turned toward the front door, but they were coming out of the curtains, down to the hardwood floor, and cutting off his escape. They were like little horrible wind-up toys, almost tapping as they vibrated across the floor on their bony legs, only they were alive, and they were coming straight at him. There was only one place left to go. He ran into his bedroom and slammed the door, but he could still hear them, those legs clicking like 100 clocks. There were multitudes of them now. He backed away from the door, watching and waiting for the inevitable. He knew they were coming, and they weren't going to stop until they sunk their clattery teeth into his flesh. The clicks grew louder and louder. Then tiny wooden taps filled his ears as several of them started up the outside of his bedroom door. Click, clack, clickety-clack. He covered his ears, but the sound seemed even louder than before. It was like they were in his head, eating at his mind. They couldn't speak, but if they could, he could hear them saying, "We're coming for you, Jacob. We're coming for you, and we're going to eat you alive." "Go away!" he screamed in a cracking voice that had never escaped his lips before. He squeezed his cupped hands tighter and tighter to his ears as he continued to go into full panic mode. "Go away!" The nightlight gave off just enough of a glow for him to see the dark rectangle shape of the single twin bed. But in his distress he stared at the door as he continued his backward steady path. The heel of his right foot came to a dead stop against the chest at the foot of his bed, but the rest of his body tried to keep going, sending him off balance, clawing frantically into the open air. His weight shifted and his left foot tried to step back and catch him, but his sock slid along the smooth floor and out from under him. He came down hard on the wooden floor. A bolt of pain pierced through him like lightning. He lay on his back in the floor only a second before shuffling himself back up to a sitting position. He panted out of breath while his right hand pressed against his lower back, trying to ease the burning sensation from his fall. He could see them now. He was on the floor, only feet from the door, giving him an almost perfect view. They were lining under the crack of the door like an army ready for the march, and soon after that, the charge. They grew brighter than he had ever seen before, meaning they were getting stronger. They looked like wounded fireflies with their non-stop glowing tails under the darkness of the opening. It was true. They were even brighter than the nightlight now. He shuffled his slippery socks on the clean floor, pushing his way back toward the far wall of the room. "Stop! Go away!" he shouted again, but of course they didn't hear, or more likely, they didn't care. They were ready now. The first few crawled under the door, making their way across the hardwood floor, narrow board by narrow board, toward Jacob. His body began to shake uncontrollably. His fingers clenched and his knees began to spasm, kicking at the empty floor again and again. His heart chugged in his chest like a freight train. More and more were coming under the door now. Click, clack, clickety-clack. The insects' tiny feet tapped against the floor as they grew closer and closer. There were hundreds, no, there were thousands of them, and they were almost to the bed. There was nothing left to use against them. His resources were used up, all except one thing. One last thing he'd been saving for the final battle. His ultimate weapon that he hoped he would never have to use. It was the nuke bomb of all these deadly little monsters, and it was all that he had left. He reached up onto the shelf to his right, slid his hand blindly across, feeling for it in the dark. There it was, right where he'd left it. He clenched it in his shaking fist and curled up in a fetal position against the wall, waiting until there was no other alternative. The next morning. A knock came at the door, then there was silence. Moments later, another knock, this time accompanied by a muffled voice. "Jacob, are you in there?" It was Manny. "Jacob, are you okay?" There was a long silence. After several minutes had passed, another knock, only this knock was louder and more sure. "Jacob, are you at home?" This time it was the landlord's voice muffled outside the door. "I'm coming in." The knob wiggled and rattled as the key slid in, turned, and opened the door. The landlord stepped into the spotless living room with Manny close behind. Once inside, she stepped past the older man holding the key. "Jacob, where are you?" she yelled. There was no answer, but there was a sound coming from the opposite side of the bedroom door, a swishing sound. She cautiously approached and placed her ear to the door. She could hear it plainly now. "Jacob, sweetie, are you in there?" She thought she heard a mumble but wasn't sure. Something was happening behind that door. She turned the knob and slowly pushed it open. More and more, inch by inch, the room came into view. First, the clean hardwood floor, then the wet area, then the chair sitting at the foot of the bed and Jacob sitting in it with his back to her. The room was dim, but it was clear that he didn't have anything on but his boxers, and he was scratching, sanding at something. "Jacob," Manny said as she slowly entered the room and clicked the light switch to her left. Jacob turned to face her. Layers of his peeled flesh soaked in the puddle of blood at his feet, and he looked at her through the eyes of a red, faceless skull. His lips were scraped away, as was the flesh of his arms, legs, and most of his chest, revealing the torn and partly rubbed away muscle. The sandpaper he clenched in his blood-dripping fist was worn smooth, but he still swished it across his skinless thigh with one shaking hand. "I got them," the thing in the middle of the room said. His tongue escaped his mouth, and he pulled it back between his exposed teeth. "I'm okay now." His skinned body shook uncontrollably as he laughed.